So it is 10 o'clock or 4 o'clock Central Time. So I think we'd like to start on time, so this way we're respectful for everybody's calendar. So first off, we'd like to welcome you to our webinar. This is NUS Consulting Group's webinar on decarbonizing corporate natural gas emissions. It's an exciting topic for us because we get many questions from clients concerning sustainability and their net zero targets. And clearly, Scope 1 natural gas decarbonization is a difficult area to tackle and an area that has several challenges. So we thought it was a good topic to cover in a webinar and discuss some of the different facets of it. We're fortunate today to have two experts in the area, David Carlian and Cameron Skinner, who are going to lead us through today's discussion, help outline the different frameworks, the different levers, the different issues and consideration. So we thought it would be a topical webinar and hopefully the first of many to come in this different area. So with that, and being again respectful to people's time, I'll hand it over to both Cameron and David to walk us through today's webinar. If you have questions, please post them in the Q&A section of the Zoom chat. We'll most likely get to those later in the webinar, unless it's topical, and we'll stop for a moment and address them at the time. So with that, David, Cam, I'll pass the baton to you, and we can get started with the webinar.
Great, thank you, Richard. I'll just go to the next slide. So in terms of introductions to the key speakers from NUS today, I'm David Carline, the Sustainability Services Manager based in the Redhill office in the United Kingdom. I've been working in the sector around sustainability strategies for the best part of 10 years and working with NUS since May 2021. A key part of my role has been to develop our services across all aspects of net zero, and that incorporates all processes around carbon footprinting for scopes 1, 2, and 3, and developing specific roadmaps to reduce carbon emissions of commercial portfolios for large international and industrial companies.
And hi, my name is Cameron Skinner. I'm the Energy Services Manager at NUS Consulting Group based in our UK office. I've been in the industry around 10 years, and I've been with NUS Consulting Group around 6. And my focus is more on energy efficiency, on-site generation and compliance. And I'll pass back to David.
Great. So to summarise the main purpose of today's webinar, as you can see, the topic is to discuss all of the opportunities, the barriers, the risks, the advantages, the disadvantages, and the broader sustainability reporting implications around decarbonising natural gas consumption across your portfolio. And this will cover a broad number of areas for future discussion. As I'm sure you're aware, over the last few years in particular, there has been a driving focus around decarbonisation for the majority of companies working out of the UK, Europe, and the United States with global operations. And typically, most companies have started to focus and prioritise efforts on reducing electricity consumption. And as we know, there are a broad variety of tried and tested measures for reducing electricity consumption, ranging from renewable supply through to EACs, such as REGOs in the UK, GOs in Europe, and RECs in the United States, through to energy efficiency, on-site generation, such as solar PV, through to far-reaching measures such as power purchase agreements. So for the majority of the people we work with, they are aware of the opportunities and are making great headway in reducing Scope 2 emissions associated with electricity. But as we can see from this webinar, the focus is on natural gas consumption, as the options at the moment are far more complex, both from a financial reporting and practical implementation perspective. So we will be guiding you through the process of the different levers available, what can be pursued on a short to long-term measure, and what that might mean for your particular company and your industry and broader sector. And as part of that conversation, we will showcase the broader impacts taking into consideration your requirements to reduce emissions with any net zero targets you might have in place or on the horizon. So before we get into the more granular details and options around natural gas decarbonisation options, it's worth reiterating the importance of decarbonisation for your company. So under the requirements of the GHG protocol, there are various different elements under carbon footprinting accounting. They are broken down into individual scopes. So scope 1 will primarily cover your natural gas consumption alongside your corporate vehicle emissions and also fugitive emissions. So those associated with leakages from any HVAC systems across your portfolio. Under scope 2, that primarily focuses on your electricity consumption. And there are then 15 different upstream and downstream categories under scope 3, which vary considerably from business travel through to purchase goods and services, employee commuting, and also tracking and recording the emissions of any products that you might manufacture and sell across your broader business operations. From our experience working with large industrial and commercial organizations, scope 3 emissions typically account for anywhere between 75 to 95% plus of a company's overall carbon footprint. That can be higher again if you are directly manufacturing industrial products which require energy as part of their usage once they leave your factory and your operations. So while scope 3 is typically the largest proportion of a company's overall carbon footprint, addressing scope 1 and 2 is key as they are under your direct and immediate control. And as mentioned, scope 2, there are various options available that are available on the market for electricity, but natural gas consumption continues to be a more complex hurdle to address. Again, to clarify why we are focusing on natural gas consumption, there are various considerations to be taken into play in relation to reducing natural gas consumption across your portfolio. In terms of short-term requirements, any company with a net zero or decarbonisation target that's either currently being developed or reported externally will be required to showcase they are proactively reducing emissions across their portfolio, including natural gas consumption, where you have the direct ability to make those changes to the ways your business procures natural gas or carries out any business operations. Again, any clients currently aligning with or looking to align with the Science Based Targets initiative will be required to quantify all of their consumption associated with natural gas and then to publicly commit to reducing those emissions quite rapidly over the next 6 years up until the 2030 timeframe. So typically companies currently aligned with the SBTi would be expected to reduce natural gas emissions by 50% by 2030. And any company with a net zero target in place by 2040 or 2050 will be required to fully remove natural gas consumption from their business operations or to replace with a renewable alternative. And again, as mentioned, natural gas consumption is under your direct and immediate control. So companies are expected to showcase they are proactively making changes to the ways they work in order to reduce natural gas consumption. And the fourth point and the main point for this conversation and webinar will focus around the complexity. And as we'll go through the slides, you'll be provided with insights into the range of current opportunities and issues facing companies looking to reduce their natural gas emissions across their broader portfolio. And as you can see here, the discussion will focus on 5 main decarbonisation levers focusing on natural gas consumption. So that will include biomethane certificates, renewable gas supply, energy efficiency, electrification, and on-site generation. And as you can see in this slide, those options do vary considerably from market-based measures, such as the purchasing of biomethane certificates or renewable gas supply, through to more proactive measures, such as energy efficiency and the electrification of your natural gas consumption. And as we will showcase, all of these have a variety of broader sustainability reporting implications, costs, and changes to the way your company carries out the heating and manufacturing processes across individual sites. So to start with the first lever, one option available for commercial organisations to reduce natural gas consumption takes the form of biomethane certificates. In relation to electricity, for instance, the market is currently very well developed in relation to energy attribute certificates. So in the UK, we have renewable guarantees of origin, or REGOs. Across Europe, we have guarantees of origin, GOs. Across the United States and Canada, we have renewable electricity certificates, or RECs. They have been in place for a number of years. They are very well regulated and provide companies to directly purchase them to report a direct reduction in their electricity consumption. It hasn't currently been the same situation for the natural gas sector or for biomethane certificates. So at the moment, the biomethane market, both for supply and certificates, is in the very early stages of development. But there are options for companies to purchase biomethane certificates, also known as renewable gas guarantees of origin, or RGGOs, as part of a procurement exercise to purchase renewable certificates for gas consumption. They are typically generated per 1 kilowatt hour of generated biomethane, and again, can be purchased across a limited number of markets. At the moment, there is some market development across the UK, parts of Europe, and specific states in the USA. In comparison to the electricity market, the certificates are still developing in relation to regulation and trading, but we are expecting to see some advancement in this area in the coming years. Again, to provide an overview of the biomethane certificates, they reflect 1 kilowatt hour of renewably generated biomethane from a number of sources. And as you can see on this slide here, they vary from food waste to crop residues, animal waste, organic wastewater, and landfill. So unlike renewable electricity, which are generated from 100% renewable sources, there are broader implications associated with the individual biomethane sources associated with biomethane certificates. So as we can see in this slide, the generation of biomethane certificates will have an associated carbon intensity score, and that takes into consideration the entire life cycle emissions associated with different biomethane certificates. And as you can see on the chart here, different sources will have a different carbon intensity associated with its use and generation. So one example being animal waste, for instance, which has a carbon negative score, and that takes into consideration the impacts of utilizing animal waste and converting into biomethane in order to generate renewable gas. And if the animal waste was left, that would result in releasing methane into the atmosphere. And again, all of the sources then have different impacts in terms of their carbon intensity. So different biomethane certificates will be associated with different fuel sources and different associated carbon intensity scores. It's also worth mentioning at this stage, any biomethane should always be directly generated from a waste source. So in this case, for instance, food waste or animal waste, which would otherwise not be put to use and would release more potent GHG emissions into the atmosphere. So key number of considerations to understand and observe when making decisions around biomethane certificates. One being the location. At the moment, biomethane is generated in a small number of markets, both in Europe, the UK, and across the United States. At the moment, there is not the same generation capabilities across the majority of markets as there is for renewable electricity. The key factor also to take into consideration is the associated cost of biomethane certificates. And these can vary considerably, taking into consideration the location, the sustainability standards, and the mentioned carbon intensity score. At the moment, biomethane certificates are at one of their lowest points in the market, and can be purchased across parts of the UK and Europe for around £9 to £10 per megawatt hour. But they do fluctuate and can go up to around £60 plus per megawatt hour for biomethane certificates with a negative or zero carbon intensity score, and those which have been purchased from sustainability certified standards. And there are various organisations that can certify the broader sustainability impacts of different biomethane sources, such as the ISCC.
David, so again, if I can interrupt you, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We did have one question which I think is timely. One of the questions was, what is the level of recognition amongst the different bodies with regard to biomethane certificates? And how standard of practice is it? If they're not recognized, what's the point of purchasing them?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So as mentioned, all of the variables that come into play in relation to the carbon intensity score of biomethane certificates and the broad sustainability implications means that currently they cannot be regulated and governed in the same way as energy attribute certificates for electricity. And at the moment, they are not currently recognized for reporting a reduction in emissions in association with leading standards such as the Science Based Targets Initiative, the SBTI, or the GHG Protocol. At some point this year, hopefully in 2024, the SBTI will be making a public announcement confirming whether or not biomethane certificates and renewable gas supply will be permissible for reporting a reduction in Scope 1 emissions, but we are currently waiting for that final decision to be made, hopefully at some point in 2024.
Thank you.
So any company looking to purchase biomethane certificates would then have to contract with a specialist provider, again, to obtain specific quotations for their gas consumption, taking into consideration the markets in which they operate and the time periods in which they need to cover. So that then leads us on to the second decarbonisation option for companies focusing on natural gas decarbonisation. And similar to biomethane certificates, there are options available for renewable gas supply. And again, to echo the previous comments, unlike renewable electricity, which has very well regulated and uniform and standardized markets across the UK, Europe, and the United States, the current situation for renewable gas is also in the early stages of development. So similar to biomethane certificates, renewable gas can be generated from a variety of sources, including food, animal, and agricultural waste. And this would enable a company to directly procure with a renewable gas provider to meet their gas consumption requirements across individual sites or their wide portfolio, as you would contract for the supply of renewable electricity. And again, like biomethane certificates, at the moment, this is still in the early stages of development across most markets. There is some availability from suppliers across certain parts of North and Western Europe and certain states in the USA. But at the moment, even where suppliers are able to provide a proportion of renewable gas to meet the requirements, typically they can only meet around 10 to 20% of your gas consumption requirements through the provision of renewable gas. The remainder, the 80 to 90%, is typically then offset with broader carbon offset credits. So even where it is available, it's currently very limited in supply, and most companies can only supply a small proportion of the overall requirements for a company. When the renewable gas is injected into the national grid, it can be used in the same way as natural gas for any heating or manufacturing processes. And we have seen some leading companies start to develop their own generation of renewable gas to either directly supply and their business operations, or to generate the associated biomethane certificates to report a reduction in Scope 1 emissions. As with biomethane certificates, at the moment, renewable gas, due to the various carbon intensity and broader sustainability implications is not recognised by the SBTi or the GHG protocol for the purposes of reporting a reduction in gas 1 emissions. But again, we are looking to clarify that position with the GHG protocol and the SBTi later in 2024. So again, just to echo some of the main barriers for renewable gas supply, currently limited to certain markets and certain suppliers across the majority of the world. Due to its limited availability, most suppliers can only meet a very small proportion of overall gas consumption requirements. And again, similar to biomethane certificates, there will be a considerable uplift in costs due to the lack of availability across the majority of markets, even those which are more developed in relation to renewable energy generation. The most important implications for any company to acknowledge is at the moment, this wouldn't enable you to make a direct reporting reduction in Scope 1 emissions. Any company who is purchasing either biomethane certificates or natural gas consumption or natural gas would be required to make that fully transparent within any external reporting requirements or frameworks until we have clarification from the leading international standards. Some companies are looking to procure renewable gas supply as a short interim measure, whilst they look to develop more proactive plans for reducing gas consumption, such as on-site generation or electrification. So we are seeing some movements with certain markets and certain companies directly purchasing renewable gas supply as a short-term fix before they advance on more on-site technical solutions.
David, if I could, there's a couple of good questions that are, I think, timely at this moment. One was about the delivery of our gas or renewable gas. Typically, is the delivery through the standard grid, or is it some other methodology? Could maybe you talk, or at least touch on that topic a bit?
Yeah, so to renewable electricity, it will be generated by anaerobic digester systems and then directly input into the national grid, as we see for renewable electricity. As mentioned, some companies can directly generate and develop their own biomethane on site if they have the specific requirements and processes in place. We are seeing some companies do that. And again, some companies are directly manufacturing, generating biomethane for the sole purpose of generating the associated biomethane certificates, which can then be sold and traded with different companies and organizations.
And one follow-up question that was asked is, do you have any data on the calorific value of biomethane compared to natural gas?
Yes, that's something we can probably follow up as part of a direct response after this webinar. We can provide the associated links and figures.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, so again, sorry, Cameron Skinner speaking. This is where I take over from David. Probably important to note that David's been talking about the procurement of certificates and renewable gas. From this point on, we're going to be talking about technology and how that can help natural gas and the removal of it. So over the next few slides, I'm going to discuss areas around moving natural gas from within the business. This will be via the use of energy efficiency. I'm going to cover the opportunities, the barriers, and how this impacts sustainability. So on this first slide, we've broken energy efficiency out into 3 categories in terms of financial commitment. As you can see, this is number 1, no-cost actions, number 2, low-cost actions, and number 3, long-term investments. And I'm just going to briefly talk about what each of these refer to. By number 1, no-cost actions, we're typically referring to the monitoring of existing data and heating controls of the building. By monitoring existing data, I'm really referring to reviewing any natural gas data that you already hold. It could be that you do a monthly review, or it could be that you decide to collate the data for 2019, for example, and 2023, and then do a comparison between those 2 years to see how your usage has changed. When performing any review like this, it's always worth noting that you should look for unexpected consumption. For example, if you're using your gas for heating, and in the summer months you're seeing as much being used as in your winter months, there's something not quite right there. You should also look for reductions if you've already implemented efficiency to remove natural gas. So if you started to electrify your business, is that showing in the natural gas data? And then lastly, still under number one, no cost, heating controls. This is as simple as reducing the heating on your flooring. So it could be the floor you're sitting on, it could be the building. While this is a small change, this will reduce your natural gas. It's also worth noting that you have to ensure that the temperature remains comfortable for your employees. So moving on to number two, low cost actions. This typically covers the further insulation of a building and sub-metering where appropriate. So by insulating your building, I'm typically talking about draft proofing, so blocking gaps around windows, doors and floors that let cold air in and warm air out. You can also look at solutions like window film, which is a form of temporary secondary glazing. So it literally just applies across your existing windows and stops heat escaping. And lastly, sub-metering. So to give you a better understanding about how your natural gas is used, you can employ sub-metering. This will be of particular interest if you're using natural gas within any form of process. So if you're manufacturing a product and it uses natural gas somewhere within that chain, you could sub-meter to better understand how that's being used and what that amounts to. And then lastly, number three, long-term investments. This refers to typically heat pumps and electric boilers. And long-term investments for most businesses is going to be a change to how they've looked at energy efficiency before. What I mean by that is energy efficiency is normally 3 to 5 year paybacks. When you're talking about areas like heat pumps and electric boilers and stripping away legacy equipment that uses natural gas, the typical payback is around 8 years in terms of a return on investment. So what capital your business invests in terms of when they get that back based on the efficiency of the product installed. And then lastly, just to summarize this slide, as you can see on the left, to understand what your site or portfolio maybe needs, the best way to do this is have a site audit performed. This will be an engineer attending the site in question. They'll typically spend a day, but it could be more depending on what's needed. They'll tour the site, they'll understand how the natural gas is being used and what processes are being used. From there, they'll go away and write a report that tells you what you can do in your business, what's appropriate for your specific site, rather than just general energy efficiency. And then just still under the energy efficiency banner, I wanted to raise heat pumps simply because they are, for most businesses that use natural gas for heating, a very good way of stripping out that natural gas and acting as a direct replacement. So just for those of you that aren't familiar with what heat pumps are, they are an alternative way of heating the building as opposed to the conventional way of using natural gas. As a side note, they can also provide cooling and in some cases hot water. Now, as you can see on this icon to the right, air source heat pumps, they capture heat from outside air and move it into your building, as opposed to ground source heat pumps, which harness natural heat from the ground through a series of underground pipes and again move it into your building. And then the key takeaway from this, as you can see, is both of these solutions use electricity. So in most cases, depending on obviously what your gas demand is, having a heat pump allows the removal of existing gas boilers and all the associated components. Just as a kind of comparison between them, as you can see, they both provide heating and cooling, whereas ground source heat pumps typically provide hot water. And the real difference is insulation. So typically air source heat pumps are easier to install than ground source heat pumps, given that ground source heat pumps require excavating of land around the building to obviously install an underground pipework. With that complexity comes a cost increase. So in comparison to ground source heat pumps, air source heat pumps are fairly cost effective, whereas ground source heat pumps are a longer term investment. And I think just if I end on that comment on the left there, for every 1 kilowatt hour of electricity needed to power a heat pump, and this is either air source or ground source, the output of heating is typically 4 kilowatt hours delivered to the building. And I guess the takeaway, just to summarize.
Can I interrupt you? Because there's a good question on heat pumps, and it's probably a good time to ask it. One of the questions is from somebody who's attending the webinar is, they found some challenges when implementing heat pumps, particularly in sites located in colder weather. such that in places in North America and China, they're saying where the winter design temperatures of -10°C to -20°C, what would your recommendation be about heat pumps in some of these more colder climates? Are they effective, or would you have other recommendations?
Yes, it's a good question, Richard. So air source heat pumps for colder climates will not be appropriate, given that they're using the outside air. Ground source heat pumps will be much more appropriate, where the ground will maintain a certain temperature throughout the year and therefore be less affected by the colder air above the building. So if you're in any kind of colder climate, you should look to do ground source heat pumps. And hopefully that's answered the question. But again, feel free to contact me afterwards if not. Just lastly, kind of the takeaway points for this slide. Heat pumps, in most cases, depending again what your natural gas is used for, can provide the same level of heat to a building, and they do it more efficiently. Now, they do that because they're using what we call pre-existing heat. They're not, unlike a gas boiler that's having to generate new heat, they're effectively recycling heat that's from outside air or under the ground. Okay. Now, without really putting a title to it, we've already been discussing electrification on the last couple of slides. Just for the benefit of everyone, electrification is the removal of natural gas from your processes in your building and the replacement with electrical solutions. I think the reason we wanted to highlight this slide really is that and as we've almost touched on a bit, for most companies or most businesses, if you're using gas for heating, there is a clear outline as to how you can replace that natural gas via heat pumps and electric boilers. So you have your process. It's just about deciding as a business, when are our net zero targets? When do we need to stop using natural gas by? Right, let's invest and begin the project. For any company, organization that has gas for a process, so you're again a manufacturing company, you're manufacturing a product, this becomes much more difficult because you're effectively saying you want to remove a product that is directly responsible with making your business money. So if you have, for example, any kind of supply chain that relies on gas, it could be, for example, as we've seen on the bottom here, you could be in the chemical sector, iron and steel, food and beverages, anything that requires natural gas in the process, it's going to be very difficult for you to remove that from your process with a solution that's electrical. So just for that area, we want to cover a bit more detail. It obviously depends on what sector you're in, but typically the best way to remove the natural gas is one, to have a call with an engineer and do a desktop feasibility study to understand how the natural gas is being used, what type of consumption are we talking about, what are your operating hours, and then from there, a follow-up site audit that doesn't just have an engineer attend for the day. They typically stay around 4 to 5 days, so the whole week, just to see those processes happening and work out how they can replace that natural gas. And then just briefly on the right, we've just put key areas to consider when electrifying. I think the biggest thing for business is going to be the cost. So the removal of natural gas, the existing equipment that goes with it, the framework, and then the installation of that electrification is going to be expensive for businesses. We've touched upon how this is obviously going to be a change for your building in question. So it could, if you're again, either an office or manufacturing, this could delay what you're doing as a day-to-day activity. And then probably the last thing I'll just touch on this slide is the availability of electricity. So as more and more companies and businesses electrify their properties, their portfolios, is there going to be the local electricity from the grid? Is the grid going to be able to meet this demand, this increase in electricity?
And maybe, Cam, if I could jump in there for 1 minute. The last point that Cam highlights is a great concern to us on the procurement side and other sides of the business, in that if you look at the grid and generation capacity today, the more electrification that we see natural gas make that transition, the more we're concerned about the availability of electricity and the system to deliver it. When you look at the transition to EV vehicles, the electrification of large manufacturing and process, and then finally, the growth in data centers in AI, the amount of electricity, the demand is going to be quite substantial. And that clearly is a concern going forward as you model these types of transitions. And more importantly, and when you look at the underlying profile of the grid, as you can see, as we move more towards sustainable electricity, you can see throughout Europe and the US, price volatility from quite high to negative is growing. And as a consequence, the movement towards electrification has greater considerations. Sorry to interrupt you.
That's fine, thank you. And then lastly for myself, on-site generation. So the focus of this presentation has been the removal of natural gas from organizations' portfolio. However, with that removal, as we've started to touch upon, you're going to have an increased reliance on electrical solutions. So your electricity is going to rise, and therefore your, and we haven't touched on this too much, but your cost is going to rise because typically electricity is more expensive than natural gas. So to support that and really mitigate the electricity rise you're going to see as you remove all of your natural gas, we've put in on-site generation. Now, when we say on-site generation, we're talking about behind the meter installation. So that will be, for example, it could be solar. It could be solar on your roof or solar on the ground around your building. It could be wind if you have the appropriate land. And then to support that, and whenever you generate electricity, any of that electricity you're not using within your business, you could look at battery storage as well. Now, again, there's many benefits, many barriers. I think that the kind of key thing I'll focus on is just the point Richard just mentioned there. It's the de-risking of energy price volatility. So if the energy prices rise for whatever reason, a part of your electricity has been segued away for generation, and that's going to be covered. Therefore, you're taking away the cost. And it's also, as we talk about sustainability, a very positive message for your clients, future clients, for your employees, and just as general CSR targets. It's a very much a message you can say, we've decided to generate our own electricity. This is what we would classify as additionality. Just a few touches on the barriers. I think the key thing is that most companies have feasibility studies done, and in these feasibility studies, the engineers over-egg what the payback or the return on investment is going to be. And I mean, by that, I mean they're saying the sun is going to shine every day, and therefore your solar is going to generate loads of electricity, and it's going to be the perfect wind condition every day for your wind turbine to move. However, you know, especially being in the UK, we know that's not the case. So what we find is you're always better to underestimate what these generation projects look like, so that when it comes to month one and the project's up and running and you're checking the data and showing your board and everyone what the generation is, it surpassed what was expected as opposed to not met the threshold. And then lastly, under barriers, I think the key thing is operation and maintenance. You know, it's great when, for example, solar goes on the roof. You think about it for a week, you maybe check the data, and then you start to forget about it as time goes on. They need to be maintained properly. The equipment has come a long way in the last 5 years in terms of efficiency. However, they still need to be cleaned. They still need to be checked because they have moving parts in terms of the inverters. So just, yeah, annual inspections to make sure that they're doing exactly what they should do. Okay.
Apologies. One question that we received was a question about the availability, installation, and use of electric boilers. What's been your experience with that, and how they perform cost-wise and the like?
Okay, so the availability of electric boilers, for our example here in US, we work with a number of partners who can provide them. They're fairly available. Electric boilers are a technology that have been around a long time. They are efficient in their use. However, they are not cheap by any means. As I mentioned a number of slides ago, typically the payback for electric boilers is around 8 years in terms of return on investment. And also you're going to be paying a higher commodity price for the electricity as opposed to natural gas. So they're a very good way of taking natural gas out of your business, but they're not a reduction in costs by any means. If anything, it's an increase in costs.
Thank you.
Thank you. Again, just to touch on that, that will be the kind of, say, for example, you have targets by 2030 to remove all natural gas from your business. It might be you decide, well, we're going to keep our natural gas boiler because it's only been installed 2 years ago. We're going to remove it in 2029 because why would we do anything else? We're going to meet our targets, but we're not going to waste that cheaper commodity and the efficient boiler we still have in place. But again, that's a discussion for each business to have internally and decide how they progress.
Maybe before we
Okay.
go to takeaways, we've had several questions concerning green hydrogen and the consideration of replacing natural gas with green hydrogen. And also, there hasn't been a big take up so far in green hydrogen. Do you have a view on the development and the evolution of green hydrogen and its use?
Yes, we know a number of companies are hoping green hydrogen will be the savior of natural gas decarbonisation. We haven't spent too much time or focus on it this particular webinar, in that we are addressing those measures which are available on the current market. Again, hydrogen will be a longer term ambition. We are seeing in some markets, such as the UK, there is a hydrogen strategy where we will see trials start to come into force in certain industrial clusters over the next 5 to 10 years. But at the moment, it's not going to address short-term natural gas decarbonisation efforts or targets, say, for 2030. But it is slowly being introduced in different studies and trials across the UK and parts of the US. But for the time being, it's going to be something we have to keep our eye on as the market develops. But for companies looking to make proactive reductions in natural gas consumption between now and 2025, 2030, it will definitely require the inclusion of the measures we have listed so far.
Yeah, and maybe just to add a little bit to that, the hydrogen market is clearly, as you said, developing, but it is quite a complex one, and hydrogen generally takes a good deal of energy to create as well through the electrolysis process. So it does seem to be a solution that's a consideration that's a ways off, but yet unclear as to its ultimate suitability, availability, and cost. Sorry, guys, I'll let you continue with your takeaways.
Right, yeah, so to provide an overview of the different decarbonisation levers that have been mentioned, as we have showcased, there are differing levels of timeframes, complexity, and costs associated with all of these different levers. And again, to clarify the situation regarding market-based measures, so those which can be secured through different procurement exercises for biomethane certificates and for renewable gas supply. As mentioned, at the moment, biomethane certificates, the market is in the early stages of development. They are currently limited to certain markets, primarily the UK, parts of Europe, and certain states in the US. And because of the complexity around the carbon intensity score and the broader sustainability implications, they are not currently accepted by leading international standards, and we are hoping for clarification at some point in 2024. So we are again seeing some companies purchase them as a short interim measure, whilst they are looking to develop more proactive solutions through the different levers mentioned on this slide. And again, it's a similar situation for renewable gas supply. So where it is available, companies are able to procure renewable gas as part of their utility procurement exercise. But again, this is currently limited to parts of the UK, Europe, and the US. And where a supplier is able to provide a renewable gas solution, typically that will only account for around 10 to 20% of actual renewable gas supply. The rest will be made up from carbon offset credits. So again, there are the broader sustainability implications associated with renewable gas. And from a reporting perspective, at the moment, it's not currently accepted by the GHG protocol or the SBTi. And again, we are hoping for clarification on that point in 2024. So for both biomethane certificates and renewable gas supply, the two market-based measures, they are currently having to address limited supply, availability, and uplifting costs. and also broader sustainability reporting implications. Some companies are purchasing them as a short-term measure to showcase they are trying to make headway in their Scope 1 natural gas decarbonisation reporting. That would then lead on to the more proactive on-site measures, such as energy efficiency, which again can be addressed through on-site engineers carrying out a specific assessment of your heating and manufacturing processes to identify particular opportunities at the site level. Again, those opportunities can be identified and addressed on a short-term basis. On-site generation, again, can be identified following on-site audits and desktop analysis to identify specific opportunities around heat pumps, solar PV, and the various opportunities mentioned by Cameron. Again, all of the on-site generation opportunities would enable a company to showcase they are proactively generating their own renewable electricity on site and producing new renewable energy that wouldn't otherwise exist, and thereby committing to additionality. And again, for electrification, ultimately that will require the assessment at the site level of specific heating and manufacturing processes to determine the feasibility and suitability of electrifying your natural gas consumption. And again, that will then result in an uplift in costs due to the higher prices associated with electricity. Any company electrifying their natural gas consumption must also then ensure the increased electricity consumption is supplied by 100% certified electricity in order to report the reduction in Scope 2 emissions.
I think just to add to what David said there as well, certainly covering energy efficiency, on-site generation and electrification, companies should be looking at what sites they want to do this for. So for example, which sites in your portfolio do you own? Which sites are leased and might be coming up for renewal and you might be moving away from? Which sites are you going to divest of in the next year or so? Because what we're talking about here are long-term investments, long-term commitments to support your decarbonisation of your natural gas. So that should be probably one of the first conversations you have with yourselves as to how you move forward. I think the other thing as well is all three of those can be handled by a site audit. So if you haven't had one, it's worth looking at getting one booked in. You might, as I said, have had a number of the energy efficiency actions already undertaken, or you might be already generating on site, but that doesn't mean that a site audit won't uncover something else that you could do. And then I guess for electrification, just to like finally add to that, it's going to be difficult. You know, we're not trying to say this is easy by any means. This is as we mentioned earlier, the removal of existing equipment that's been there for a number of years and we've been reliant on for a number of years. So it won't be a simple process of just ripping out a gas boiler. There's a lot more that goes to it. But certainly for companies where they are maybe offices or they're retailers, the direction seems clear. It's either heat pumps and or electric boilers. For companies that are using natural gas within their processes for manufacturing purposes, that's going to be more complex.
We have one additional question. Maybe I'm not sure we have the answer to, but I'll try, and then if not, we can update slides. But the question addresses biomethane or certificates and renewable gas, and the question is, since it's not widely or accepted on any standard, it seems to be recognized by country. Do we or have we generated a list of countries where it is recognized, at least today, prior to a final decision with the SBTI or other regulatory or sort of regulatory or compliance agency?
Yeah, so we can provide a breakdown of the countries where biomethane certificates can be generated, traded, and retired. So as mentioned, there is in the vacuum of EU-wide legislation and policy and governance around biomethane certificates, there has been a development of voluntary guidance and reporting from different markets. So we can provide an overview of those countries which are working and developing an approach to regulate biomethane certificates across different markets. And again, that would apply to specific states in the USA.
Perfect. Maybe if we go to the last slide, gents, couple of cleanup items. One, that concludes our, we were shooting for 45, 50 minutes, and we've been able to keep that right on schedule and therefore be respectful of people's calendars. Couple items is if you have additional questions or need additional information, this is clearly a complex area of sustainability. Electricity, as stated, is a well-worn set of pathways. Natural gas is much more evolutionary and developing in that sense. So if you have additional questions, you can contact either David or Cameron directly. Their emails are up in the presentation. If you'd like a copy, and we've had numerous questions and requests for copies of the slide deck, we're happy to provide it. If you could just send us an email at contact@nusconsulting.com, we'd be happy to share the slide deck with you. And finally, we will be making available a recording of this webinar on our YouTube page, and we will circulate that to clients and to anyone else who requests access to it, so that you'll be able to share this with colleagues or with other members of your team in the future. One, we want to thank you for attending our webinar. Two, we will be doing another webinar in the next few weeks. This webinar will be focusing largely on the dynamics of the energy market today and the pricing expectations we have for the remainder of the year and into 2025. So we hope you'll attend that. But once again, thank you for carving time out of your day. Cameron and David, thank you for sharing some of your expertise with us today. I hope we all took away something from this, and we look forward to either speaking with you or working with you in the near future.